The Kashan Historical Concordat had been verifying the recorded histories of the galaxy's civilizations for 14,000 years. Its founding charter was short, and in 14,000 years it had never once been amended. No account of the past earns the status of history until it survives cross-reference against independent, physical, verifiable evidence. Story does not become history by being believed, no matter how widely or how long. It becomes history by being checked, one claim at a time, against something that does not care what anyone wants to be true. In 14,000 years, the Concordat had reviewed the origin accounts, oral traditions, founding myths, and pre-scientific cosmologies of over 900 distinct species. The archive itself was the oldest continuously maintained institution in known space, older than most of the governments that now funded it, older than several of the star charts it used to cross-reference the myths it received. Fewer than 4% of all submitted accounts across that entire span had ever achieved full verification. The Concordat repeated that number often, in training halls, in public address, on the wall of every junior archivist's first office, not as a discouragement, but as the entire justification for the institution's existence. Belief was common, confirmed history was rare, vanishingly rare, and the distance between the two was the terrain the Concordat had spent 14,000 years mapping. The verification process itself had not changed in any fundamental way in millennia. A myth arrived, usually stripped of the reverence its originating culture attached to it, reduced to a set of testable claims. A date range, a described phenomenon, a location, a duration. Those claims were checked against the Concordat's own independently maintained archives: astronomical, geological, climatological, genealogical, built over 14,000 years by observers who had never once, in compiling that data, been thinking about anyone's myths at all. The two archives were kept deliberately separate. A myth was never permitted to inform the astronomical record it would later be checked against. That separation was the entire mechanism by which the Concordat's verifications carried any weight. Humanity had submitted its first archive for review 109 years ago. Arriving late to an institution most of its neighboring species had belonged to for millennia. Of the 4,300 distinct mythic and pre-scientific accounts humanity had offered across that century, flood stories, sky omens, founding legends, seasonal cosmologies drawn from hundreds of distinct pre-spaceflight cultures, the Concordat's verification department had confirmed 61 as historically accurate in substance. A respectable number, slightly above galactic average, filed in the archive's lower tiers, cross-referenced, indexed, and by any ordinary measure, finished business. No one at the Concordat had reason to expect that classification to change. Institutions 14,000 years old do not often revise settled conclusions about a member species barely a century into membership. Until 3 months before this convocation, when a department director ran a routine audit of an old, low-priority set of submissions, found something he could not immediately explain, and did not file his findings where anyone would see them yet. Dr. Ren Isset was 34 years old, originally from a pre-spaceflight research station that had, in its final decade of operation before humanity achieved interstellar travel, quietly doubled as a repository for materials no one had yet decided what to do with. Half of what the station held was raw scientific data, climate records, seismic logs, decades of unglamorous observational work. The other half was what her grandmother had simply called stories, and what the station's later, more credentialed staff had started filing under folklore, a word that in most institutional contexts meant interesting, but not evidence. Isset had been hired into the Concordat's Junior Field Archival Division 9 years ago, on the strength of a submission portfolio that her hiring panel, 3 senior archivists reviewing several hundred candidate files that season, had read twice. They read it a second time not because anything in it was wrong, but because the first reading had produced a note in the margin from the panel's most senior reviewer that read, simply, "Check this again, something is off." What was off, it turned out over the following years, was not an error in her work. It was a pattern that took time to become visible, because no single submission looked unusual on its own. Isset's early filings cataloged myths from various pre-spaceflight human cultures, submitted in her first 2 years for standard junior-tier review, carried a verification rate nearly 4 times the Concordat's institutional average. Her hiring panel's initial, reasonable assumption was that she was quietly curating her submissions, selecting only the myths most likely to survive cross-reference and discarding the rest before filing. A known and mildly discouraged practice among junior archivists eager to build an early verification score. The internal audit that eventually followed found no such curation. Isset had submitted every myth contained in the collection she worked from, unfiltered, cataloged in the order her source materials presented them, with no apparent selection bias in either direction. The unusually high verification rate was not a product of what she chose to submit. It was a property of the material itself. Appearing consistently across collections, she had never personally selected inherited archives, digitized station records, materials she had simply been assigned to process as part of her rotation. Director Absalom Thrio, who eventually ran that audit personally rather than delegating it to a junior statistician as protocol technically allowed, read her personnel file 4 times over the course of 1 week. He found nothing in it that offered an obvious explanation. Isset had no formal training in astronomy, geology, or orbital mechanics. Her academic background was in comparative linguistics, a field with no natural overlap to the sciences that would eventually confirm her submissions. She had not cross-referenced her filings against the Concordat's own independent event archive before submitting them. The internal timestamps showed clearly that she filed first, and that the correlations were discovered afterward by other verifiers working the standard review queue, entirely independent of anything Isset herself had checked or claimed. She had simply cataloged what her research station's old materials contained, in the order she found them, and sent the results up the chain the way any junior archivist in her position would have done, with no apparent awareness that the pattern in her results was unusual at all. Absalom asked her about it directly once, in a brief unplanned corridor conversation 8 months into his audit, phrasing it as casually as he could manage. He asked why she thought her submissions verified at nearly 4 times the department's baseline rate. Isset had shrugged, unhurried, the data slate she habitually carried tucked under one arm, and said she genuinely didn't know, that the stories she had grown up hearing had simply always seemed, to her, like they were describing something that had actually happened to someone, rather than something invented to explain what no one understood. She had not thought the observation was significant enough to mention to anyone before he asked. The challenge came, as such things often did at the Concordat, during the quarterly review colloquium, an open session in which senior archivists presented notable findings from the preceding cycle, and junior staff were permitted, by a tradition older than most current staff's careers, to raise questions of anyone in the room regardless of rank. The tradition existed to keep the institution honest, to prevent seniority from calcifying into unexamined authority. In practice, over the centuries, it had also become a venue where seniority occasionally asserted itself in the shape of a well-constructed question rather than an outright order, a distinction that mattered enormously to the people asking and considerably less to the junior staff on the receiving end. Senior archivist Sorrel Cade, Ventrian, had been ranked first in the department for verified submissions for 11 consecutive years, a career built almost entirely on a specialty in dismantling weak mythic claims before they consumed the department's limited verification resources on material that had no realistic chance of confirmation. Sorrel was, by every honest account in the building, genuinely good at this work. The department's overall efficiency metrics had improved measurably in the years since Sorrell began triaging incoming myth submissions at the intake stage, and few archivists resented the resulting rejections, because Sorrell's judgment on which myths to reject was, more often than not, simply correct. Sorrell introduced the human question the way that senior archivists at a quarterly colloquium tend to introduce questions they have been waiting for the agenda to reach, with the timing and tone of someone who prepared the phrasing well before the meeting began, and had simply been patient about when to use it. Before we closed the session, Sorrell said, addressing the room rather than any single person in it, the particular address style of a speaker looking at an audience instead of at whoever they are nominally speaking to. I'd like to raise something for general awareness, since submissions drawn from the human collections have circulated with unusual frequency this quarter, and I think several of our newer archivists could benefit from calibrated expectations before the pattern becomes assumption. A measured pause, timed the way a well-rehearsed pause is always timed. Humanity has submitted, by my own count, something over 4,000 mythic and pre-scientific accounts across a century of Concordat membership. I think it would serve the room to understand plainly what the actual verification rate looks like for material of this kind. How many of humanity's thousands of myths, out of all 4,300 of them, has this Concordat, across a full century of review, ever confirmed as anything more than story? Several senior archivists seated along the back wall smiled, the particular smile of people who have already decided, well before an answer arrives, which side of a familiar and well-worn question they intend to stand on. It was not cruelty. Sorrell had asked some version of this exact question to junior archivists working other species mythic collections a dozen times across 11 years, and it reliably did the job it was designed to do. Recalibrating enthusiasm against evidence, gently reminding newer staff that belief and confirmed history were not, under any circumstances, the same category of thing. By every standard the department operated on, it was a fair question, asked by someone who had unquestionably earned the standing required to ask it. "That's a fair question," Isset said, in the tone of someone who genuinely thought it was, without any detectable irony in the observation. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice or shift her posture in any way that suggested she had registered the question as a challenge rather than simply a question. She looked at Sorrell the way a person looks at something they have, in fact, already sat with privately for far longer than the person now asking would reasonably expect. "Do you want the departmental average," she said, "or the number for my collection specifically?" The colloquium room did not go louder in response, the way rooms sometimes do when a question sharpens unexpectedly. It went quiet in a way it had not been quiet a moment earlier, the specific quiet of an entire room recalculating, in the same shared instant, whether the question asked to establish a calibrating baseline had, without anyone quite intending it, transformed into an entirely different question. Sorrell's expression did not shift right away. It took a beat longer than it should have to produce an answer, and that beat, small, almost nothing, the length of a held breath, was noted independently by at least 3 senior archivists in the room whose long habit it was to notice exactly such things. "Your collections," Sorrell said finally, "since apparently there's a distinction here worth making." "There is," Isset said. She gave a number. It was not, measured against 4,300 total submissions, a large number. It was, in fact, a small one, 7, out of the collections she had personally cataloged and filed across 9 years of ordinary junior fieldwork. But it was not the size of the number that emptied the room of sound. It was the category attached to it, a category Sorrell had not asked for, had not anticipated, and judging by the stillness that followed, had not imagined existed at all within the department's human archive. "Verified to the day," Isset said. "Not verified in substance the way the departmental average measures it, verified to the specific day." Director Absalom Thrio rose from his seat at the back of the colloquium room, before the silence following Iset's answer had a chance to resolve into anyone else's question. He had run the correlation audit himself 3 months earlier, working alone through most of it rather than assigning it to junior statisticians, and had told no one the results, filing the completed work instead under a routine internal designation that kept it circulating quietly rather than publicly, until he judged the department genuinely ready to see it presented in context, not as an isolated statistical anomaly, but as something that meant what it appeared to mean. With the room's permission, he said, I'd like to bring up the correlation record, not as a rebuttal to Senior Archivist Cade's question, as an answer to it, the actual answer, rather than the one the department's averages would suggest. No one in the room objected. No one present, watching the particular stillness that had settled over Sorrel since Iset's answer, would have known how to voice an objection without the objection itself immediately becoming the more interesting story of the meeting. The record, when it appeared, was not dramatic in the way verification presentations sometimes were built to be dramatic for public audiences, with reconstructed visuals and narrated timelines designed for maximum impact. It was plain, almost austere. 5 entries, pulled directly and without embellishment from the Concordat's own independently maintained astronomical, geological, and stellar observation archives, laid beside 5 myths drawn from Iset's original human source collections, each dated independently, decades or centuries apart, long before anyone involved in either archive could plausibly have cross-referenced one against the other. The first entry was a myth cataloged from a coastal human settlement, describing a night when, in the language of the original account, the sky opened a second sun that gave no warmth, and it remained 7 nights, and then it was gone as though it had never been. The Concordat's own astronomical archive, cross-referenced by the date range embedded in the myth's careful oral genealogy, a genealogy that traced the account across 11 generations of named tellers before it was ever written down, confirmed a supernova visible from that settlement's hemisphere, independently logged through Concordat deep sky survey data collected centuries after the myth was first recorded by an expedition with no knowledge the myth existed. The survey's calculated visible duration, 6 to 8 nights, depending on atmospheric conditions at the settlement's precise latitude. The myth said 7. The second myth described a great dark hand passing in front of the sun at midday, for the length of what the account called a long breath. During a season, the myth's genealogy dated with striking specificity, anchored to a particular harvest, under a particular named chieftain, in a lineage of tellers who clearly understood the account as history rather than metaphor. Concordat Orbital Mechanics Reconstruction, originally run decades before Iset's submission for entirely unrelated survey purposes, with no reference to any human material, confirmed a total solar eclipse crossing that exact region within the precise window the myth's genealogy implied, with a calculated totality duration of just under 3 minutes, a long breath, if the phrase was taken literally rather than as ornament. By the third case, Sorrel was no longer smiling, and had not been for some time. Sorrel was watching the projection with the expression of someone performing a recalculation that was clearly going to extend well past the remainder of the scheduled colloquium, and beginning, visibly and without any attempt to disguise it, to suspect that the recalculation would not resolve anywhere near where the original question had assumed it would land. The fourth case was smaller in scale than the others, and somehow heavier for its smallness. A minor myth, rarely cited even within specialist human archival circles, described a mountain that breathed fire and turned day to night for 3 full years. An account so specific in its claimed duration that earlier Concordat reviewers, working the standard Q decades before Iset's tenure, had flagged it explicitly as embellishment, reasoning, not unreasonably, that no plausible natural event could darken a sky for 3 consecutive years, without leaving unmistakable evidence across multiple independent survey types. Absalom's audit, driven by the same stubborn thoroughness that had eventually made him a director rather than a career field archivist, cross-referenced the claim anyway, and found a documented volcanic climate event buried in the Concordat's independent geological and climatological survey archive. Its measured atmospheric effects lasting just under 3 years before clearing, logged originally, decades earlier, purely for unrelated climatological research, filed and forgotten until someone finally thought to check it against a human myth no one had taken seriously. The fifth case Absalom did not narrate at all. He let the correlation stand silently on the screen, a myth describing a star that died slowly, and then all at once, and its light kept arriving for 100 years after it was already gone. Set directly beside Concordat deep field observation logs confirming both the death and the subsequent dimming timeline of a star in the exact region the myth's genealogy described. The light delay window in the astronomical record matched the myth's stated duration within a margin that the presiding astronomers seated in the colloquium recognized immediately, and said so quietly to one another, as far tighter than coincidence should plausibly allow across a span of that length. The sixth case, the last Absalom chose to present, was the oldest myth in Isset's original collections, and the one the department's earlier reviewers had rejected outright, decades before, as clearly allegorical rather than descriptive. An account of 3 lights that danced together in the winter sky for one season and were never seen dancing again. Concordat Stellar Motion Archives, cross-referenced only after the pattern in Isset's other submissions prompted a second look at material previously dismissed, confirmed a rare, temporary optical alignment of 3 stars visible from the myth's originating region, an alignment whose calculated visible duration matched, almost precisely, 1 full observational season. The room sat through all 6 cases in a silence that had changed character somewhere around the 3rd entry. No longer the ordinary silence of polite institutional attention, but the deeper, more specific silence of an institution 14,000 years old recalculating, case by case and without exception, something it had assumed settled about the difference between story and record, for longer than most species in that room had existed at all. Sorrel rose before the final projection had fully dimmed from the screen. Sorrel did not look at Absalom, and did not look again at the correlation record still faintly glowing above the dais. Sorrel looked, briefly and directly, at Isset. The first time in the entire colloquium Sorrel had looked at her rather than past her toward the room she had been addressing all along. Verified to the day, Sorrel said, and verified in substance. Those still aren't the same claim, whatever the correlation shows. No, Isset said, they're not. I never said they were. Sorrel said nothing further. There was no scene in the exit. No formal concession entered into any departmental minutes. No gesture that could later be cited as an admission. Sorrel crossed the length of the colloquium room at a measured, unhurried pace that gave nothing away, and the doors closed without ceremony behind an archivist, quietly recalibrating something built carefully over 11 exacting years, choosing, deliberately, to finish that recalibration somewhere the room could not watch it happen in real time. Isset gathered her materials, a single data slate, the same battered model she had carried through every fieldwork rotation for 9 years, its casing visibly cracked along one edge from a fall early in her 2nd year that she had simply never gotten around to reporting for replacement. She had nothing else to carry out of the room. She had not planned to say anything further to anyone, and true to the pattern Absalom had noted in her file months earlier, she didn't. Absalom caught her before she reached the doors. 3 months ago, he said, I finished that audit and sat on it deliberately, because I wanted to see what question would finally force it into the open on its own, rather than through a memo nobody would fully read. I didn't expect it to be Sorrel's question that did it. Why not circulate it yourself once you had it? Isset asked, She didn't sound accusing when she asked it. She sounded like someone who genuinely wanted to understand his reasoning. Because a director's memo gets filed, cited twice, and forgotten within a year, Absalom said. A room watching a correlation appear in real time, in direct response to a real question someone actually asked in good faith, that doesn't get filed the same way. People remember rooms, they don't remember memos. He glanced down at the cracked slate still tucked under her arm. You've carried that thing through every rotation for 9 years, cracked case included. Any particular reason, you never requisitioned a replacement. It's never actually failed at anything I needed it for, Iset said, unhurried, the same way she had answered every other question that day. Seemed like a strange reason to replace something that still works. She left the colloquium room without further explanation, the same unhurried, unremarkable way she had entered it that morning, before any of this had happened. Absalom returned alone to his office later that evening and opened the department's annual correlation report. The same document every director before him, across generations of the role, had used at the close of each cycle to record a single formal summary judgment on the year's most significant verification finding. Beneath the newly entered line logging Iset's 6 confirmed to the day human myths, and the full correlation evidence submitted to support each one. In the space reserved specifically for the director's own closing assessment, he sat for a long moment before writing anything at all.